Laba diena.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First and foremost, I'd like to thank you for finding time in your busy agendas and to learn about the Election Assessment Mission final report of the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. The report on the parliamentary elections that were held in Lithuania on the 9th of October 2016. I'm very happy to welcome the Deputy Speaker of the Seimas, Ms. Rima Baškienė. Also, we have guests. Mr. Alexei Gromov is the election advisor at the OSCE. And we also have his colleague, Mr. Richard Lappin, who is the deputy head of the election department of the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. First and foremost, I'd like to give the floor to Madam Baškienė.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, distinguished guests. It's a pleasure to welcome you here today. Members of the Central Electoral Commission, members of the Seimas, ladies and gentlemen, today is a very meaningful day to discuss our experience of our recent election. Although the election is already over, the processes are ongoing, and we must also be forward-looking in order to ensure democracy, fairness, and transparency. And this is exactly what we were trying to pursue. Of course, our citizens, our election monitors were all contributing to this end as well. I see a lot of positive things in the final report, which goes to show that Lithuania is heading the right direction, as well that our Central Electoral Commission and its constituencies are doing the right job. They employ the right staff. All in all, serve to the cause of democracy. We must also thank the media for ensuring the highest level of transparency as possible and awareness raising among our society. As a woman member of parliament, I am really pleased to hear that about 30% of the candidates were women. But the activeness of the electorate is the most important thing. The activeness and engagement in the election process. And there's still a lot to be done in our country, because when it comes to the activeness of our electorate, there's still a lot that could be improved. We have to make sure that taking part in the election and exercising the right to vote is being exercised more actively. As legislators, we find it very important to look into our legal framework to find out whether or not it is fair and rational. We are thinking and considering amendments of the Code of Elections. And I hope that today's discussions and your comments and remarks might also contribute to these amendments. Some of the initiatives have already been registered with regards to the depoliticization of the Central Electoral Commission. Perhaps you will disagree with that, and maybe you will add your own ideas to it as well. So I appreciate this timely discussion, and I hope that your remarks will be meaningful for us as politicians as well. Thank you. Thank you, Deputy Speaker. If I may, I would like to say a few words of my own to begin our discussion and recall the last elections in Lithuania, which were the 7th parliamentary election since the restoration of independence. And for me, it was a great pleasure to take part in basically all of the parliamentary elections, especially as the chairman of the Central Electoral Commission. We have always received positive remarks towards our election processes. However, democracy is an evolving process, and we have to be self-critical as well. Nevertheless, we must also preserve the accumulated experience and ensure the independence of the Central Electoral Commission from the political parties. In addition to that, we must also look for ways how to improve the effectiveness of the activities of the Central Electoral Commission. The recent elections were famous in that they were, of course, fair, pluralistic. We had 10 candidates willing to take one seat. So we had a very high turnover. The election engaged over 14,000 of international monitors and they will observers, and they will present their own report. We also provide an opportunity for our voters to vote in other polling stations. They're not limited to one specific polling station. We've tried to ensure as best as possible conditions for the people with disabilities to vote. I see some of the people representing the organizations working to ensure availability of information during the election. I hope they will also take the floor today. Of course, quite a lot of information that has been disseminated by us was devoted to spreading the information on the candidates. The list of the electorate, the electronic list of the electorate was also introduced as a possibility in our election. We also had a possibility to tally the information on the electorate, which was able to vote from any parts of the world. All of the novelties were very interesting and very important, and all the personal data was protected from any cyber attacks. However, we did face some technical issues because it took us as many as 2 hours to release the information, which is not usual in other countries already working with these novelties. And as far as you can remember, we've concluded with the tallying of the voting results at 20 to midnight. I've memorized the time very well because the majority of the constituencies managed to do their job very quickly and announce the final results. One of the main principles that we follow is transparency and openness. And we are rather open about the difficulties that we face. Sometimes perhaps we do face some deficiencies with regard to public relations, but I believe that openness and transparency pays off in the end. We've tallied or retallied the results that we were requested to do so, and the candidates were able to be convinced of the transparency and openness of our staff. The biggest drawback to our election processes is the vote buying. However, we must definitely note the efforts by our police forces, the White Gloves Initiative, and the Council of Youth Organizations, which did a lot to avoid as much as possible vote buying. The number of claims has decreased by as much as threefold. And we had only a couple of cases which led to pretrial investigations. And there was one rather sad case when one member of the Seimas was actually deemed to be elected on an illegal basis, and therefore we were forced to withdraw its mandate. And the candidate did not even attempt to contest the result. We did not accuse him of doing any illegal activities. However, the environment related to his election was the one that shed some doubt as to the legality of his election. As for the assessment of the election, this is the most important part of the work related to the assessment of the activities by our electorate. We see that our current elected majority in the parliament maintain the support of the public, and I do hope that they will continue to have the support of the majority of the population. And I hope that they will continue to take positive decisions appreciated by the public. And now I would like to give the floor to our distinguished guest. As far as I understand, Mr. Richard Lapin would like to take the floor first. He will then pass over the floor to Alexei Gromov. So, Richard, please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Madam Deputy Speaker, Chairperson of the Central Election Commission, and honoured guests, thank you for this opportunity to join you today and to present the conclusions and the recommendations from our final report on last year's 2016 parliamentary elections here in Lithuania. I would like to begin by expressing my warm appreciation for the welcome that ODIHR has received today and for the good cooperation that we've enjoyed with the authorities, political parties and civil society in Lithuania over many years. In particular, allow me to highlight the excellent relations with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Central Election Commission, and to thank them for their strong support and promotion of this visit. Allow me to also positively note the early timing and inclusive nature of this meeting, with representation from political leaders, the election administration, government ministries and civil society. This provides an opportune moment for broad consultations, well ahead of the next elections, to identify an agenda for possible changes to electoral law and electoral practice. The convening of this meeting at the Parliament is also significant, and we appreciate the positive commitment at the highest political levels in Lithuania to address ODIHR's recommendations. This is a powerful signal of the value and the importance placed on making further improvements to the electoral process. Indeed, this briefing at the Parliament continues an excellent tradition in Lithuania, with ODIHR having previously presented its election report at the Parliament after the 2012 elections. This is not only a good practice here in Lithuania, but it sets an important example for other OSCE countries interested in the follow-up of electoral recommendations. During our presentation, we will outline the key recommendations from our report, and we'll have an opportunity to discuss these in detail, as well as measures already identified by the Central Election Committee, political parties and others to address areas of concern. But in my opening remarks, I would like to first briefly underscore the general importance of a follow-up to recommendations and the approach of ODIHR in supporting states in this important aspect. ODIHR has now observed or assessed more than 320 elections across the OSCE region since the mid-1990s. The potential benefits of election observation are well understood. It can play an important role in promoting transparency and accountability, as well as enhancing public confidence in an electoral process. Yet, observation is not an end in itself. Rather, it is intended to assist states in implementing their election-related commitments and obligations. A core part of our work, therefore, is the recommendations that we offer to improve legislation and practice. Indeed, the utility of election observation can only be maximised if these recommendations are given serious consideration and if they are effectively addressed. This has been recognised by all OSCE participating states, including Lithuania, which committed themselves in the 1999 Istanbul document to, and I quote, "follow up promptly ODIHR's election assessments and recommendations." Since this time, follow-up has become an increasingly important issue for all states within the OSCE. And to promote more effective follow-up, ODIHR now regularly presents its final reports with recommendations in the country following an election. Such visits serve as an opportunity to further discuss our findings and our recommendations, as well as possible areas of future cooperation and assistance. These meetings happen across the full OSCE region. Recent visits include to Iceland, Albania, Georgia, the United States of America and the Russian Federation, amongst several others. In this manner, we very much welcome this meeting, which demonstrates Lithuania's clear commitment to consider ODIHR recommendations. And should reform be initiated, there are a number of good practices that we would advocate. First, we would encourage that it be early. This gives adequate time for it to be completed well in advance of the next elections and allows the administration, the voters, the parties and civil society sufficient time to prepare and become acquainted with the new rules. Second, we would encourage that it be inclusive. Reform of the electoral framework is essentially about reforming the rules of the game. It should not be the exclusive competency of the winner or the main parties, but also involve meaningful consultation with the election administration, smaller political groups, civil society, and other stakeholders, including those at risk of marginalisation such as women, national minorities, and persons with disabilities. And lastly, we would encourage that there is an agreed framework for reform, concrete deadlines, and clear responsibilities. This helps to ensure accountability and effective implementation. From our side at the ODIHR, we're ready to offer our support at all stages of a reform process, offering constructive and practical expertise based on OSCE commitments and international standards, as well as comparative experiences from across the OSCE region. This includes providing legal opinions on draft amendments, contributing to expert roundtables or discussions on specific issues, and providing advice on technical implementation. Now, to turn to our findings and recommendations in Lithuania, as many of you will likely recall, we deployed an election assessment mission for these last elections, which were the third elections observed by ODIHR in Lithuania. The mission included a core team of 6 experts based in the capital, but also visiting several municipalities during their activities. And as in all of the 57 OSCE participating states, these elections were assessed against OSCE commitments, such as the Copenhagen document, other international obligations and standards, such as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as well as rulings of the European Court of Human Rights, and of course, national legislation. Our report was released in January of this year with an unofficial translation provided in Lithuanian, and I believe you have copies of this today. And it was very pleasing to learn that the report was widely disseminated in both English and Lithuanian, including on the CEC website, a very good practice. Our report concludes positively, and I quote, that the elections were competitive and pluralistic, offering voters a broad choice of political alternatives. Contestants enjoyed equitable campaign conditions and competed in a process characterized by respect for fundamental freedoms. In light of issues identified in past elections and against the background of corruption scandals earlier in the year, elections took place under an overall strengthened legal framework with enhanced oversight and enforcement. Other positives were also noted: that the legal framework provides a sound basis for the conduct of democratic elections, that the elections were administered in a professional, efficient and transparent manner, and that there is a high level of public confidence in the accuracy of voter lists. But, of course, there are no perfect elections anywhere in the OSCE region, anywhere in the world. Politics is dynamic, democracy is dynamic, and electoral processes must respond to long-standing as well as new and emerging issues. If there are gaps or ambiguities in the law or practice, these ought to be addressed at an early stage so as to avoid them becoming real and serious challenges at a later stage. As such, our report noted areas that could benefit from further review and made a total of 19 recommendations to support efforts in strengthening the electoral process. These related to various issues, including candidate rights and registration, campaign finance, media oversight, public availability of voter lists, and the testing of IT equipment, as well as the participation of women, national minorities, and persons with disabilities. In addressing these recommendations, some may require changes to primary legislation, and here the role of Parliament is vital, while others may require changes in conduct or in administration, be it by election management bodies or political parties. I would also like to underline that our recommendations are not legally binding, nor are they intended to be excessively prescriptive. International obligations recognise that a variety of electoral systems exist and that states have a wide margin of appreciation in deciding how their systems will fulfil these obligations. As such, our recommendations are intended to advise and to assist rather than to direct. They should leave sufficient leeway for adaptation to specific circumstances. International actors like ourselves at ODIHR can highlight the obligations and commitments that should be upheld, identify gaps or ambiguities in compliance, and provide assistance in strengthening elections. However, it is ultimately the state's responsibility to address these issues. Reform must be internally driven, and this requires demonstrated political will. In this sense, we were encouraged that some ODIHR recommendations from the past were addressed before the 2016 elections, including those related to campaign finance, the delimitation of electoral boundaries, the time frame for appointing the Central Election Commission, and deadlines for considering complaints. We very much hope that this electoral cycle, before the scheduled presidential election in 2019 and the parliamentary elections in 2020, can be used to further refine electoral legislation and practice. With this in mind, I pass the floor to my colleague, Mr. Alexei Gromov, to outline the specific recommendations in more detail. And allow me to close my opening remarks by reiterating our appreciation for joining this important meeting. We welcome the interest in following up on our recommendations, and we very much look forward to today's discussions as well as future cooperation.
Good afternoon, honored participants, and I would like also thank you for this opportunity to present the recommendations of the OSCE ODIHR final report on last parliamentary elections in Lithuania. As Richard already mentioned, the legal framework in Lithuania generally provides a sound basis for the conduct of democratic elections. Furthermore, we did comment that the implementation was sufficient and reasonable. However, some of our interlocutors did raise some concerns over a lack of clarity of campaign and campaign finance rules, over some deadlines on candidate registration, and handling some complaints, in particular media-related complaints. We did report that certain regulatory gaps were addressed by the Central Election Commission, but this could not always be remedied in full without exceeding the scope of the law. And therefore, our first recommendation was, in fact, to review the legal framework to address past and present OECD recommendations, address existing gaps and ambiguities. Our kind of idea and actually call to also to address the initiatives of the civil society, of the Central Election Commission. We were informed that the Central Election Commission is also providing some comments and actually proposals to adjust the legislation. But we would rather highlight that the reform process, the electoral reform process, should be undertaken well in advance before the next electoral cycle and should involve open consultation with all stakeholders involved in this process. We should, of course, keep in mind the ongoing process of codification and harmonization of the electoral legislation, which is due to happen since 2013 already. Taken into account quite long time before the next elections, there could be a very good opportunity not only discuss and formally address our previous recommendations, but also try to discuss all the rest ongoing activities and issues which are now discussed in the society. If we speak about harmonization of the electoral legislation, this could inter alia touch upon the next issues. One of the long-standing issues and actually concerns of OECD is decriminalization of defamation. Defamation, as we know, is still remains criminalized, and in our view, it is a necessary step to fully guarantee the freedom of expression. As Mr. Vaigauskas already mentioned, the transparency and openness of the electoral process is a crucial aspect of each and every election. And we understand that a lot was already done to improve the voter registration system, the voter identification of voters on election day, and this did provide quite reasonable and high confidence of the voters, of the main interlocutors in the voter registration system as such. But still, consideration could be given to making voter lists publicly available before the election day for public scrutiny, while it is necessary, of course, to maintain the security of personal private data. As we discussed and we were informed during the election assessment mission, the state, and it is positive, actually takes special care to the security of private data. And we do appreciate such approach. It is really very useful and positive. But we also would like to draw your attention that such a recommendation on the publication of voter lists has been implemented in many countries, and publication of voter lists is a good practice and can build a trust on a voter registration system and to electoral process in general. Of course, the system, the necessary mechanism to protect private data should be in place, but the publication of voter lists can really enhance the electoral process. One of the also long-standing recommendations from ODIHR is to address actually to provide explicit right for citizen organizations to observe all stages of electoral process. We do really appreciate that international observation is fully guaranteed and supported in Lithuania, and we were actually one of happy recipients of these provisions and the attitude of the Lithuanian society. But eventually, and everybody knows that not international but local citizen observation, citizen observers should be the real watchdog for democratic electoral process in a given country, and their functioning should be fully protected by the domestic legislation. Yes, we did acknowledge in the report, we did highlight that there were no problem with accreditation and actually with the access of citizen observers to polling stations to observe the electoral process. But again, this is one of the OSCE commitments to provide also access of domestic observers, of citizen observers to electoral process in the legislation. Another quite long-standing issue is that the legal reform, the upcoming legal reform, could potentially address a possibility for judicial review of final election results by a competent court. This was recommendations from 2012 already, and we would say that nothing wrong is that the Constitutional Court's conclusions on a potential challenge of election results go to the Parliament. These conclusions go to the Parliament as a basis for the Parliament's decision on the validity of election results, and it's absolutely fine. But contrary to the OSCE commitments and international good practice, the Lithuanian law does not provide a mechanism for such parliamentary decision on election validity to be appealed to a judicial authority. And we speak here about that any administrative, in this case we speak about an administrative decision of the Parliament, could be heard or could be potentially appealed and checked through a court system. Another series of recommendations, assuming legal changes, relate to candidate registration. As the report noted, an inclusive candidate registration process resulted in a broad selection of contestants, political parties, and even independent candidates standing for these elections, and the procedure itself was really good. And it is a very positive assessment, which can not be often read in our ODIHR reports with regards to other countries. Some countries, unfortunately, provide some discriminative criteria for standing as candidates for the elections, including for national elections, exclusion of some categories of people from election, or apply too restrictive rules for registration and nomination and registration procedures. And this is not the case in Lithuania. But in order to further improve the process and duly guarantee against any discrimination in future, the law could be further tightened and improved. We talked already in the past, and it is now, we can refer to our recommendation number 11 in the report, that the lifetime ban on candidacy rights of impeached individuals should be repealed to comply with the respective European Court on Human Rights decision. Definitely everybody are aware of this situation, and to our mind this should be addressed in the legislation and constitution in particular. We also say that restrictions on candidate rights for people with dual citizenship should be removed. We would draw attention that both actually these recommendations are based on the principle of non-discrimination in electoral process. ODIHR knows and positively commented in this report that both problems did not surface during the last autumn elections, and many people do not regard these issues as problematic, and this is a very positive sign. Nevertheless, the legal framework should not provide an opportunity to misuse or potentially selectively apply such provisions in the future, or even encourage some other countries, neighboring countries, to introduce such limitations. You know that the electoral process and electoral related commitments is the overall, not concerns, but actually the public discourse happens about electoral practice among all the countries, And this could be a good example to not to make a negative example for other countries. Another provision which could be seen as also potentially restrictive, the number of support signatures needed for registration of candidates. Again, there were no really problematic issues observed during this election from our side, but the nature of registration of candidates is to provide or illustrate a seriousness of claims of potential prospective candidates to run for the elections, or to prove a minimum support from the people from electorate. And it is quite reasonable, decision approach for any legislature and for any electoral system. But we should keep in mind that any formal procedure needed for verification of this candidate's eligibility should not be restrictive. Especially, it should not be burdensome for new political forces. It should not be burdensome for realization of the human rights to stand for the elections. And the good electoral practice sets quite a reasonable number of signatures to be collected for registration at only 1% of corresponding voters in a constituency, in a given electoral constituencies. Otherwise, the larger number of such signatures could be seen as restrictive, and therefore we do recommend to decrease the required number of the signatures to be collected for registration of candidates to a maximum of 1% of the numbers in a given constituency. Let's continue to speak about registration procedures. They should not be restrictive, they should not be burdensome, but they also should be fair enough. Everyone can make a mistake, and Lithuanian legislation does provide a very good mechanism for making corrections to initially presented documents. Yes, there can be negligence, there can be some mistakes, there can be not really intentional misinformation from candidates or even political parties, and there should be a chance, a real good chance to correct the mistakes. Nevertheless, practice showed some discrepancies between the legal deadlines for candidate registration and candidate nomination, candidate registration, and actually possibility to correct the mistakes. And therefore, we recommend to adjust the deadlines for the submission and verification of nomination documents for candidates, and provide candidates a real opportunity to rectify the mistakes. And the last but not the least recommendation related to candidate registration touches upon the candidates themselves. As Madam Bashkiniene already mentioned, women amounted to 31% of candidates who were running for this election in autumn. And only 21% of newly elected MPs are women. It's a bit lower than average throughout OSCE region. I wouldn't be maybe not precise, but approximately in average some 27% women are MPs in national legislation across OSCE region. Of course, it's even this average indicator is a bit less than this millennium goal aim, and the law, as we mentioned in our report, the law on elections, as well as statutes of many political parties, do not provide for any special measures aimed at enhancing and representation of women in public life. Indeed, it's not an obligation of the state, of Lithuania in particular, to impose quotas in electoral process for women, but this is a commitment of Lithuania to promote gender equality and facilitate women's participation in political life. And this is a base for our another recommendation that political parties could be encouraged to promote gender equality, to increase visibility of female candidates not only during electoral process but also during everyday political life, and also to integrate gender issues into their platforms. This, for example, could be done by exercising voluntary measures by the political parties themselves to promote their members, members in everyday life, in political and electoral process, or even through introducing some financial benefits related to, for example, public funding of the political parties or some other mechanisms. I can also speak about an introduction of a gender requirement for nomination of party lists for parliamentary elections, and this could be seen as a temporary legislative measure. You probably know that special quotas for women participation at elections are often referred to as a positive discrimination, which is good, and nothing wrong with this, and actually such a practice proved to be very effective in many countries. The third large topic is campaign finance. Both ODIHR and GRECO have already positively assessed the campaign finance regulation, the system of campaign finance regulation in Lithuania. And your example can serve actually as a good example for many other countries. Not many countries do provide quite reasonable and decent regulation of this very specific and very difficult topic and topic of concern. Despite some negative comments on unnecessary tightening the campaign finance regulations, as well as potential ways for circumvention the rules, I would say that I was a part of actually needs assessment mission 2 years ago and 1 year ago, and several political parties say, no, you see, it's not really so serious. It's always possible to circumvent and actually to ignore the regulations. But I hope that the practice does show that the rules, first of all, should be adhered to. If the political parties do follow, in general, the rules, it's good for everyone, for rule of law, for perception of public, to the transparency of the finance, to the fairness of the elections in general. And actually, I hope that the phenomenon during these last elections, that the vote buying was not such an issue this time, could also be kind of a very positive indicator that the campaign finance rules do work, and partially the campaign finance system does effectively work and provide some transparency in this situation. Nevertheless, some of our interlocutors raised concerns over the role played by so-called third parties during the financing the campaign. The third parties, according to Lithuanian law, are not obliged to report on their sources of funding. They are not reporting on their expenses, but they can support the political parties, candidates, or even kind of provide their own campaign activities, which is nothing wrong. But this was identified by some interlocutors as potentially undermining the transparency of the campaign and finance system in general. And therefore, we do recommend to further define the term third parties. How could it be defined in the law? And to define this term for campaign finance purposes and to extend regulation to these groups, including for donations, expenditure limits, and reporting requirements. Another point which was raised during our observation is the sanctions envisaged by the law for campaign finance violations. The law, to our assessment, does not provide actually for a gradual system of sanctions for violations. The CEC can either impose very strict financial sanctions, for example, loss of public funds for political parties, which can be quite tough sanction for a political party, or vice versa, quite low administrative fines. And there is a good practice and from different countries that consideration could be given to amending the law in order to provide proportionate, effective and dissuasive campaign finance. There should be several layers, several levels of potential sanctioning for different violations, and they should be effective. One more topic which we covered quite extensively in our report is participation of national minorities. You probably noted that the overall assessment of participation of national minorities in the electoral process is really positive. These groups enjoy the right for association in Lithuania. They enjoy opportunities to use their mother language during their campaign and other political discussions in everyday life. They are indeed active and well integrated in the society, and this is a really positive phenomenon. Nevertheless, we noticed that several elements of the legal framework do not facilitate minority representation. This includes the threshold for entering the parliament, quite high threshold for entering the parliament, the increased membership requirement for parties to be registered, just for registration of political parties, and the recently introduced restriction on the inclusion of candidates from other parties in party lists, in so-called coalitions, which have to face actually even a higher threshold to enter the parliament. So, you know, and we know, and we always speak about that the participation of national minorities in each and every country is really very delicate questions. It's really very important to feel how it is used and actually how it is perceived in each and every country, each and every even region. But our recommendations is for the Parliament and for the society is just to think about potential special measures which could be introduced to facilitate minority participation in public and political life. This could be, for example, a low threshold for entering the Parliament for national minority political parties, or lowered threshold for party membership in establishing the political parties. And such measures should be definitely pre-consulted with the representatives of national minorities before any legal changes. As a positive step, we noted that the voter education and information materials were translated and published in Polish and the Russian language. However, these materials, again, it was not largely our assessment, but it was a concern expressed by national minority representatives. Such information was not as comprehensive as the information produced in Lithuanian language. And public debates also at public broadcaster were broadcast in Lithuanian language only, limiting information available to citizens from national minorities. Yes, there are quite a lot of difficulties to enhance not participation but actually information of people who do not possess or have some difficulties to speak or listen or actually to understand the state language. And there were actually positive developments. There were subtitles in different materials. Some campaign materials were translated into national minority languages. And we again reiterate that effective participation of national minorities could be supported by producing comprehensive voter education and information in their local languages. I think this is pretty it from my side. Thank you very much for your attention, and maybe we could go into a discussion mode now.
Ačiū labai gerbiami.
Thank you indeed for a very comprehensive presentation of the final report and the recommendations. We all have the final reports in front of us, so I guess having listened to the presentation, you might have some questions to the keynote speakers. Well, I don't want to restrict the discussion. I hope that everyone has something to say. But first, before speaking, please introduce yourself. I would also like to note that among us, we have members of the Office of the Committee on Local Administration, on State Administration and Local Authorities, also members and staff from the committees. Madam Irena Šiaulienė, member of the Seimas and the leader of the Social Democratic political group. Good afternoon. I congratulate the Central Electoral Commission for the positive assessment of the elections. We are grateful to the OSCE mission for the final report and for the recommendations. I guess some things could be changed by our members of the parliaments. We have to ensure the development of democracy. But since you are the representatives of a very serious democratic institution in Europe, I have a question to you. We are currently starting the discussions concerning the principles of the members of Central Electoral Commission. I wonder whether the principles for the formation of the Central Electoral Commission are good in comparison to other practices, I mean to practices in other countries. Previously, we had that parties who came to the parliament had to delegate their representatives to ensure the balance, and now there were proposals to eliminate party representatives. And if we vote, I don't know whether we vote for another proposal, which says that a member of the Central Electoral Commission should not belong to any political party for 3 years. And I wonder whether this is consistent with the European legal practice.
First of all, thank you very much for your kind words about the report that we produced, and it's a very good question. It's a very important question. It's one which is often asked in many countries across the OSCE region. The very short answer is that there's no standard. There's no universal model which is advocated by the ODIHR, by the Council of Europe, by the UN, or others as to how an election management body should be formed. It should undertake its activities independently, and the two standards, if you will, which we assess election administration bodies against, is that one, they're administratively effective, and second, that they conduct their activities in a politically impartial manner. These two aspects are crucial to building public confidence in the electoral process, which is a vital cog, as we see across the world right now. The confidence in elections being administered is absolutely fundamental. Looking comparatively across the OSCE region, there's a wide range of different models that are used. Some rely entirely on political appointees, some rely on government ministries solely undertaking them, some a combination of the two. What we would say is, based on our assessments, particularly in the last elections, but previous elections as well, we assessed the conduct of the Central Election Commission and indeed the lower level administration bodies to be professional, efficient and transparent. And this is a key conclusion for us, and one which frames and underpins our overall assessment of the electoral process. But the choice of how to form an administration body is very much a national choice, which can take into account different views, different ideas about how public administration should be formed. What we do suggest is, if there are to be any changes, this is a fundamental element of the electoral system, so that such changes be discussed in the widest possible format, that there be broad agreement on any changes to ensure that public confidence remains, and that it's made in due time to allow people, especially potentially new commissioners, to become fully acquainted with the rules sufficiently ahead of any electoral process. What I would say as well, and as the CEC chairperson mentioned earlier as well, is the need in some ways to safeguard or to protect institutional memory. What's on paper and how things happen in practice, there's a lot of work which goes on behind the scenes, and this experience, if there's ways to safeguard this, it's to be very much encouraged. One positive practice we see in a number of countries when there is a transition between different models of election administration is to stagger the change. So that individual commissioners are not all changed at once, but there's a transitional period which allows this sharing of information and to make sure that key knowledge is not lost. I think I would leave my comments there. I don't know if, I hope that answers your question.
Ačiū.
Thank you. Please introduce yourself. Good afternoon. Justas Pankauskas, Vice Minister for Justice. Well, in general, I have a supplementing question or rather a comment to what has been said by the member of the Seimas. In the amendments to legislation, it has also been proposed to eliminate the Ministry for Justice or the Minister for Justice, so that this institution could not propose its representatives to the Central Electoral Commission, having in mind that the Ministry for Justice is the institution that is responsible for the formation of the election policy and practice in Lithuania. So from our perspective, from the perspective of the Ministry for Justice, we would think that some representative from the governmental body should be represented in the Central Electoral Commission too.
Thank you very much. And this is a very clear and practical example of how some of this knowledge and institutional memory is vital to the working of an election administration body. I think it also indicates as well the need for these broad discussions, not only about what's favoured, but the reasons as to why certain people should be involved or not in the election administration. There are indeed many different models and many different ways in which, even if certain officials from ministries or officers aren't included directly in an election body, that they're still consulted and still have a very important say and opinion, if you will, on key issues. As I say, I can only really repeat that if such changes are to happen, that they happen with the widest possible consultation, understanding the different viewpoints and ahead of time, to make sure that this is something which doesn't diminish what is generally a very high level of confidence in the electoral process, which is enjoyed in Lithuania. I can also add as well that from our office, what we've done in previous countries in the past is to provide expert workshops, expert roundtables to discuss different models of election administration, the pros and cons. No single model is perfect. There's advantages and disadvantages to every model, but we'd be happy to share some concrete thoughts and some concrete examples from other countries to try and contribute to an informed discussion on what's a very important aspect of an electoral process.
Ačiū. Kas dar turi?
Thank you. Anyone else? Goda Burokienė, member of the Seimas. We have a huge diaspora abroad. Have you assessed the possibility for the Lithuanians abroad to vote in the elections? And maybe you have some examples how to attract diaspora to vote in general elections.
Again, a good question, and as with most good questions, they're often quite challenging questions and difficult ones to answer. The issue of diaspora is one which is affecting almost all OSCE countries right now. The movement of labour and persons across the European space in particular is high, and this provides a number of challenges when it comes to people exercising their right to vote. Again, this is one of those issues which the states have a very wide margin of appreciation. The European Court of Human Rights has passed a number of judgments on this issue. Essentially, if I can paraphrase very briefly, the way the standards point to it at the moment is there should be no restrictions on people willing to return to the country to vote. As a citizen of that country, you retain your right to vote in the country if you have citizenship. On the flip side, the court has ruled in the past that there's no obligation for states to necessarily facilitate voting abroad, be it through embassies, postal voting, internet voting. There has to be, again, an informed discussion, broad consensus on how this is done, taking into account the costs involved of making sure the vote is available to those outside, and that it's done on an equal and fair basis to all expatriates and diaspora abroad. Across the OSCE region, again, the practice is very mixed. Some countries allow it, some countries do not. Some countries include the expatriate vote within the votes for the capital city or a dedicated constituency. So there's a very broad range of models, and this has, I imagine you're well aware, has a very strong political dimension to how it can affect the electoral results and the electoral representation within the parliament afterwards. So again, it's one of these very sensitive issues which I think merits a very long and informed discussion to make sure people are in full agreement because of the consequences it can have on the formation of the parliament.
Prašau, gerbiamas Povilas Gelys.
Mr. Povilas Urbšys, member of the Seimas and chairman of the Committee on State Administration and Local Authorities. He is from the committee that looks deep into the work of the Central Electoral Commission and the elections in general. Thank you very much for the tremendous work that you have completed. It is our committee that has to look at the recommendations that you have provided.
Rekomendacija yra nurodyta, kad turėtų būti.
First of all, in your recommendations, you identify that all the criteria of the rights and duties of the observers have to be clarified. And could you be a bit more specific? What kind of clarity do you expect? Now, secondly, your recommendations envisage a possibility to get to spread information on the list of on the voter list. Could you also specify what would be the purpose of making the voter lists available for public scrutiny, and why would that kind of public scrutiny would be meaningful? And thirdly, you also indicate in your recommendations to assess the final election results by a competent court. In our country, we have a certain hierarchy of courts. And even in the Constitutional Court, if needed, we might assess the results. So what do you actually have in mind by saying a competent court?
Thank you for the questions. Let me just try to stick to the report. So first of all, about the clarity on status of citizen observers. Yes, you know, and we referred to actually paragraph number 8 of 1990 OEC Copenhagen document, according to which the states committed themselves and committed that presence of both international and citizen observers is really helping to have a transparent and actually credible elections. To our mind, the Lithuanian law does not specifically provide possibility for citizen observers to observe the electoral process. As I earlier mentioned already, the practice is very good. The CEC did provide the possibility to observe the process, but still, according to OEC ODIHR approach, we think that this right of citizen observers, of non-partisan citizen observers, should be explicitly provided in the law. And when, while reading the recommendation, we speak that the law should be clearly said, yes, first of all, the citizen observers should be allowed to observe, and not observe just elections, but all stages of electoral process, including candidate nomination, campaign finance issues, counting, tabulation and deriving the results, participation in complaints and appeals process, and so on. So that actually internal domestic citizen initiatives could be a really effective watchdog for electoral practice, and this is the meaning of our recommendation. Another question about publication of voter lists. As I noticed previously already, we think, and not only we, but actually the transparency of the process of each aspect of the elections is really crucial aspect of elections. We know, and we did confirm in our report, in our assessment, that there were no real kind of problems. There were no huge, how to say, concerns about accuracy of the voter lists, about potential, maybe, I don't want to talk in this manner kind of about any manipulation with voter lists and so on. But if you try to look kind of around throughout different countries, there are different approaches, there are different actually efforts to play dirty games with the voter lists. It is connected usually with how to say, with potential a changing of the voter lists, some adjustment of the electoral constituencies, and so on and so on. It's quite often that it's not true. It's potentially it's kind of allegations or even exaggeration of different people and so on. But in order to avoid any claims or kind of in order to avoid decrease of public trust to this situation, publication of voter list is a really good guarantee that each and every person, each and every candidate, each and every political parties, if they want, they could double check whether, yes, these voters are registered first of all, no one is excluded from the voter register, and they are assigned to correct electoral constituencies. You understand, and previously Lithuanian parliament already got through this procedure, that it's very important also to count how many voters are assigned to each and every electoral constituency, so that the vote was guaranteed as equal for each and every voter. And we assume that this is really very positive practice to publish the voter lists. Of course, the private data and what we mean kind of address, maybe date of birthday or any ID details, they should not be definitely published, but definitely the names of the people, the age and potentially address, this should be publicly available for public scrutiny. And the third point about judicial review of the final election results. Yeah, there is no also uniform practice. In different countries, the election results are finalized by this, for example, Central Election Commission, or by courts, or by parliaments. Indeed, the practice is really different, and there are no unique receipt how to better do it. But there is an overall commitment, actually, of the states and of Lithuania as well, that any administrative decision and the validation of election results is also one of the administrative decisions, should be subject to judicial review. The main idea of this requirement, maybe, or recommendations, is actually to provide independent review of not review, but validation of the election results. Of course, we understand, and in Lithuania, the outgoing parliament is reviewing and finalizing the election results, which is absolutely fine. We did comment already on this, but still, the political body is not always absolutely independent in their kind of approach. We know maybe it's good in some countries, bad in other countries, but still quite a lot of parliamentarians from the outgoing parliament go to another one, and they should or could actually tolerate whatever any maybe problems or maybe some negative aspects. And in general, the professional community doesn't refer as the parliament itself as really independent body to finalize and to actually to make a final decision on the results. This is nature of the recommendation.
Just a very small point to add to the details here is that these three issues, again, were not problems identified in the past elections, but the reason why we flag these and make recommendations on these issues are for two reasons. One, we assess all 57 OSCE participating states against the same standards, OSCE commitments, international obligations, and other standards. So as an organisation, to be fair and equal to all of our members, we have to assess each issue in the same way. And this is one reason why we do this. And the second reason is we very much believe that it's best to address gaps, ambiguities in advance, rather than at a later stage when it could potentially become a problematic issue. Public confidence in elections is very much a precious commodity. And in other countries we've seen, if I can be quite frank, that it's sometimes taken for granted, this confidence in the election administration. And once it's lost, it's very hard to recover. So these steps, which might seem small at this stage, can be a very good long-term strategy to safeguarding and protecting the trust in the election administration.
Ačiū labai, man regis, gerbiamas Povilas.
Thank you. I guess Mr. Urbšys raised very important questions related to the transparency of elections. Well, I saw a very nice mechanism in Sweden when a voter comes to the constituency and he informs the commission that he would like to come to observe the elections. And if there are not many voters on that day, they invite this public observer, civic observer, and they are able also to observe the tallying of votes. I believe this will not be difficult to implement in Lithuania. Well, some of my colleagues in the Commission, as well as political parties, have doubt as to the efficiency of this. But as far as the protection of personal data, I am also for introducing the mechanism to ensure protection of data. I know that in some countries, those electoral lists with all the personal data are put somewhere on the wall in the polling station very publicly. So I think that our Agency for the Protection of Personal Data would be absolutely against that. Voting lists pose no doubt to us, but I guess it would be very nice just to discuss these issues in the Parliament of Lithuania. And I think that some of the amendments might require the amendments to the Constitution as far as the judicial review of final election results. But as far as I know, we had previously had no cases when we wanted to appeal the results. When the Constitutional Court adopts a conclusion, the conclusion is approved by the Parliament of the Republic of Lithuania. At least it was the practice that the Seimas had always approved of the conclusion. If the Seimas did otherwise, the Constitutional Court might have adopted some other different conclusion. So, in Lithuania, we have a paradox that the final election results are validated actually by the parliament which has been elected. So there might appear some means for manipulation, but the creators of the constitution decided that this mechanism would be good for us, which, well, but in practice we have not faced any problems. Of course, there are always some theoretical potential that there might be abuses. Well, I don't know whether Mr. Lapin and Mr. Gromov would like to comment on what I have said, whether you approve of what I have said. And I wonder whether there are anyone willing to speak. Ingrida Taneliene from the Constitutional Court. I have a colleague with me, and we are grateful to you for the opportunity to take part in this discussion, because we had a chance to meet the observer mission before the elections, and therefore I'm very happy to see this feedback. My question is related to the jurisprudence of the Constitutional Court and the constitutional law. So I'll give the floor to my colleague for a comment, and then I will have some remarks, some very brief remarks, if you allow me, which are very important for the Constitution of the Republic of Lithuania. Thank you. As far as the final election results are concerned, the Seimas adopts the decision as to the validation of final election results in only one case, when there is a conclusion of the Constitutional Court that the law on election was violated. So that's the only case. So when the Seimas approves final election results, this is done by the resolution of the Seimas, and every legal act of the Seimas can be appealed in the Constitutional Court. So I believe this is already a kind of the scrutiny. As far as the validation of final election results, I've heard that some independent body could validate the results. I know that in some other countries, the final election results are validated by a court, usually by the Constitutional Court. So one of the proposals could be that the final election results of the parliamentary elections could be validated by the Constitutional Court. But of course, this proposal requires wider discussions and consultations. Thank you. Then it seems that I have the possibility to appeal against the conclusion of the Constitutional Court. But you also have no right to appeal the decision of the Constitutional Court. Our society believes in justice, therefore it believes in the rulings and judgments of the Constitutional Court. Here, we are talking to how people might understand the validation of results, so that they did not pose any questions related to placing trust in the election process and in the results of the election process. I know that in Poland, when results are validated by a competent court, then there is also quite a lot of dissatisfaction that they cannot appeal. In Lithuania, I think it is positive that the decision of the Central Electoral Commission can be appealed. Well, I'm not always happy about that fact, because we have some additional work to do, but this is a positive thing for the election process itself. If I may, I have a few remarks with result to the conclusions that are related to the constitutional law. In one of the priority recommendations, was related to the restrictions on candidate rights for people with dual citizenship. At the meeting in the Constitutional Court, we have already touched this issue, but I'd like to use the opportunity once again and to comment the specificity of Lithuania with regard to this question, and why the recommendation that you have made could be questioned in the context of the constitutional law. The OSCE recommends that the restrictions on candidate rights for people with dual citizenship should be removed. This recommendation is related to two very important constitutional provisions. Part 2 of Article 12, which states that no one can be both a citizen of Lithuania and a citizen of another country. So that is a ban of a dual citizenship, or a ban of a multiple citizenship. And people might have dual citizenship or multiple citizenship in exceptional cases only. And also we have Article 96 of the Constitution, where the Constitution states that the ban to be elected as members of the Seimas if they have pledged allegiance to another state. The Constitutional Court ruled in 1998 that to be a candidate to the Parliament of the Republic of Lithuania is to refuse the citizenship of another country, and that to become a candidate for the member of the parliament, you have to be loyal to the state and you have to belong to the to be a citizenship to be the citizen of the Republic of Lithuania. And in your recommendation, you mentioned the case of the Court of Human Rights. We are well aware of this case, both in legal and other aspects, but to our opinion, we cannot be guided by this case because the context of the case and the ruling of the court says that it was absolutely different situation. The situation of Moldova was exceptional, and that it was the only country of the Council of Europe, the constitution of which allowed dual citizenship, which is the opposite in Lithuania. Also, in Moldova, 10 years ago, from 4 million citizens, 1.5 million of them had either dual or multiple citizenship. So they belonged either to Romania or Moldova. So, which meant that exclusively large part of the population did not have the right to vote. Therefore, we believe that this recommendation is not in line with the specificity of the Republic of Lithuania. However, we do not see any incompliance with the jurisprudence of the Court of Human Rights, because we believe that the cases considered by the court were absolutely different from those that are applicable to Lithuania. Another recommendation on the ban for candidates to apply to the parliament for members who have been impeached. The lifetime ban on candidates, the rights of individuals who have been removed from office through impeachment. Well, we believe that the ruling of the court has to be implemented, but this implementation can be done only through amendments to the Constitution of the Republic of Lithuania. And maybe the experts of the mission also would agree that this is the question of one single person, which does not have a huge influence or impact on democratic elections. But I'd like to draw attention to the fact that only one example was provided. Thank you. Thank you for the questions. Anyone else? Mr. Lapin.
It's I have to say it's really valuable to have representatives from the Constitutional Court here. I think whenever our recommendations touch upon constitutional issues, they're more sensitive, more delicate, and I think this reaffirms the importance of having broad-based discussions on these issues. Two things I'd just like to say in as briefly as I can. At the beginning, I mentioned that our recommendations are not legally binding, they're politically binding. And even there, it doesn't mean they have to be implemented, but rather duly considered. And if there's a way with it, a deeper discussion, a wider range of opinions, that it's decided that it doesn't need addressing because there's different mechanisms in place which already provide a necessary solution, then that's okay as far as we're concerned. That said, let me just say two things very briefly about the Constitutional Court in potentially reviewing election results and also with the dual citizenship. With the court, the reason why we make this recommendation is based on two very specific standards, and they're quoted in the report in footnote 61. One comes from the OSCE Moscow document, which basically says that there should be judicial review of any administrative decision. And so this is quite concrete, announcing the results of the elections as an administrative decision, and then there should be a possibility to appeal this to a competent judicial authority. The Venice Commission of the Council of Europe elaborate further, and I think the quote which they give in their Code of Good Practice in Electoral Matters perhaps bears repeating. It says, "Appeal to Parliament, as the judge of its own election, is sometimes provided for, but could result in political decisions. It is acceptable as a first instance in places where it is long established, but a judicial appeal should then be possible." And this is the view we take. We understand the sensitivity about this issue, but again, being consistent to all states and based on the commitments in which we work, this is why we make this recommendation. And I think it's one worth considering, and let's see where those considerations lead to. With the issue of dual citizenship, and in part to impeachment proceedings as well, the impact which this has, we very much look at this from the position of universality. Even if it's a small group, a very exceptional number of dual citizens or multiple citizens, or one or two people who've been impeached, all standards and commitments should generally apply to all people. Any restriction should have a legitimate aim, be proportionate, and be clearly argued, which of course you know very well, and it's not for me to say this. But again, I would say that these issues are emerging jurisprudence from the European Court of Human Rights. And again, I think even though the situation is not directly comparable to the situation in Moldova, the issue of universality is one which should be considered in making any of these restrictions, either on citizenship or impeachment. Citizenship is the one issue in which voting rights are fundamentally based. Restrictions upon age or other factors can be taken into consideration, but citizenship is very much a protected category, and I think all should be done to ensure that remains universal and open to all. But again, let me say these are very delicate issues, ones which merit a very deep and detailed discussion, and it's fantastic, I think, that the Constitutional Court is here to be part of this and to discuss it with lawmakers, civil society and others, to find a solution which is appropriate for the conditions here in Lithuania.
Ačiū. Prašau, Marija.
Thank you. Maria Šuraitė, coordinator of White Gloves. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to take part in the discussion, and today I will probably voice the opinion of the civil society, which is also mentioned today. So, White Gloves is the organization which organizes the engagement of the independent observers in the election process. A slight comment to the member of the Seimas of the Committee on the State Administration and Local Self-Government. We have already indicated to him that the activities of independent observers should be described, because we do receive the information that the Central Electoral Commission can assign them at their discretion. So at the moment, we cooperate with the Central Electoral Commission on the basis of goodwill. So perhaps, yes, a more detailed description of our activities could be put in place. And my question would be related to a more active engagement of the NGOs. We can see here today present representatives of people, of organizations for people with disabilities and other NGOs. And ourselves, we see a need for us contributing to the political campaign financing activities, and how would you recommend us to contribute to all these initiatives?
Thank you very much, and again this demonstrates the importance of having a broad representation around this table. We've heard today from many different perspectives, and civil society is a very important element. We produced a handbook on the follow-up of recommendations very recently. It's on our website, and we're happy to send copies as well. But we include a section dedicated to the role of civil society. And civil society can play an important role, but it has to be very clear and concrete in what it does. So we see 3 key ways in which this civil society can have an important role within electoral reform. That's to propose changes, very concrete, practical things which are written, presentable to all, so people know where these suggestions come from, to advocate for these changes using publicity, awareness raising with the wider public, and to evaluate the changes as well. The changes offered by the Central Election Commission, MPs, the ODIHR, civil society, are they being implemented? And if not, why not? So there's a vital role to be played, and just as we would encourage the Parliament, Central Election Commission and others to be transparent and inclusive in their decision making, the same would apply for civil society, to try and bring people together and find solutions which are mutually agreeable to all, but a very important role.
Ačiū labai už.
Thank you very much for your questions and for your replies. Any more willing to pose a question? Any comments, remarks, wishes, either for the Central Electoral Commission or for OSCE representatives? Well, if not, I'm looking now towards the clock, and I suppose we should now move on to our final mission, which is extending our gratitude. Oh, sorry, Mr. Urbšys is willing to say a few words.
Noriu patikinti.
I would like to reassure that the Seimas Committee and State Administration and local authorities will assess and analyze the report by the OSCE Election Assessment Mission, as well as the initiatives by White Gloves, and we will look into the ways of initiating possible amendments to the legislation in order to deal with the existing drawbacks. Perhaps the drawbacks are related to our legal basis, perhaps there are some other deficiencies. So thank you very much for your effort, and perhaps we will be able to meet a couple of years after and assess our achievements. Thank you very much for your participation in the discussion. To my mind, the discussion was very efficient. There's a huge work that has been done, and democracy is an exchange of opinions and listening to the needs of one another, as well as finding ways how to ensure higher credibility in the election processes, so that even those who lost the election would be persuaded with the results of the election. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very good. Thank you.
Dėkui tave. Dėkui, mes komiteto įtrauksime.